back to Ghost Pirate Entertainment. I'm your host, Kanan Becker, and today we talk about 10 more horror movies that I highly recommend. And with that, let's get to the list. Heretic is a 2024 psychological horror movie, written and directed by Scott Beck and Brian Woods. It stars Hugh Grant, Sophie Thatcher, and Chloe East. Two young religious women are drawn into a game of cat and mouse in the house of a strange man.
It's a simple choice, but it should not be made simply. Belief or disbelief.
So if you're someone that watches all my videos, I'm just warning you right now, you're going to hear me talk quite a bit about this movie in the next few, because it is definitely, without a doubt, one of my favorites this year. And the type of movie that it is one of my absolute favorite styles of horror. That psychological horror, the type that just gets under your skin and sticks with you after you've seen it. The kind of movie that just days after you've seen it, and in this case, weeks after I've seen it, I'm still thinking about it. I'm still mulling it over and still having conversations in my head about it. Because I grew up in an extremely rigid religious household. Now, to be totally honest, the religious type of upbringing that I was brought up in was much more of a dictatorship, a Nazi regime type of religion. So it's not fair to really cast aspersions against other religions, or at least compare them to what I experienced. But because of that, I had to go on a long search in my life of trying to find my own answers and what I truly believed, because I couldn't go along with the way I was taught growing up, so I had to very much make my own belief system. And as much as I might have problems with religion, I love the way that it shows it from both angles in this movie. It's not just saying, oh, religion is bad and throwing dispersions at religion. But at the same time, it's also pointing out some holes and flaws with a lot of major religions that we see in our world today. And that dialogue is what I found to be so powerful about this movie. Beyond that, the cast is just incredible in this. They are all so good and play very different roles, each one of them, than anything I've really seen them play before, but they just embody these characters. Because I've seen Hugh Grant play a villainous type of character before, but not quite like this character. This is a very unique, one-of-a-kind type of character that he's portraying in this movie. And as much of a fan as I've become of Sophie Thatcher, I didn't really know who Chloe East was until this movie, and I was just as impressed with her performance here. But it's creepy and atmospheric, it's thought-provoking and well done. It's well directed, well shot, the cinematography, the set design, the costumes, everything is incredible in this. And at the time of recording this, it is now available to rent at home. And it is a pretty steep price tag of $19.99, but that will come down over the next couple weeks and months. But either way, I think this movie is fantastic. And if you haven't seen this and you're looking for something to rent at home, this is a fantastic pick. This is such a fantastic movie. It's so fun. It's so badass. It's gritty. It's grimy. It's dirty favorites. But this is right up there with it. It's hard for me to even say which one I prefer. They're very different movies. This is less of a horror and much more of an action thriller, but it does still have gore. Just did not expect. There's a lot of wrinkles to it, and every time you think you kind of got a beat on the direct on this story. But the violent action scenes are so well done in this, and it doesn't hold back at them, get their asses handed to them. So if you're looking for an action-packed, gory good time, this is a great one.
Interruption. Niveau d'oxygène approchant du seuil critique.
Oxygen is a 2021 French sci-fi thriller. Directed and produced by Alexandre Aja, it stars Melanie Laurent, Matthew Almeric, and Malik Zedi. It's about a woman who wakes up in a cryogenic chamber with no recollection of how she got there.
Pourquoi je me souviens de rien? Ce souffle.
This movie is intense. It is a bit of a slow burn and takes its time getting there, but as it gets probably the second half of the movie, it starts to really ramp it up and become very much a nail biter, edge of your seat kind of movie. I wouldn't say this movie is exactly a horror movie, although it is very claustrophobic, and if claustrophobia is one of your fears, it's gonna scare the piss out of you. But either way, it's full of tension and anxiety, and it's so well performed. Melanie Laurent is the main character. She's got 99% of the acting that's in this movie. Everybody else is just these little side characters that are in her memory, because the movie pretty much takes place with her in this crowd chamber, trying to figure out how to get out, but more importantly, trying to figure out why she's even there in the first place, who she is, and all of that. And so it's really cool just watching the movie slowly unpack what's going on, and it keeps you engaged and guessing, trying to figure out what the situation is here. And it takes some cool twist, especially towards the end, and definitely surprised me. But I think this is an absolute hidden gem that you never hear talked about, but one that's absolutely worth your time. The Furies is a 2019 action horror movie written and directed by Tony Diacchino. It stars Arlie Dodds, Linda Ngo, and Ebony Vagilens. A woman is kidnapped and finds herself an unwilling participant in a deadly game where women are hunted by masked men. This is such a unique movie. It's one of Shudder's early original movies, so it didn't get a theatrical release like a lot of their movies we see now. And in some ways, it reminds me of Azrael. It kind of has that same type of look and budget and feel to it, but it does some really interesting things and goes in some wild directions, and it's kind of not like anything else I've really ever seen. And it's a real shame that it never really has gotten any love, because it's an early Shudder original, back when Shudder was still very much unknown and only the most diehard horror fans even knew what the platform was. And so it's fun to sometimes go back and look at some of the early Shudder releases, because a lot of those are still really good movies. I mean, sure, they're on very limited budgets like this one with not a cast that you're going to really recognize, but the stories are still there. The directing style and the creativity are still there. But this has some really great visuals, stuff that'll stick with you and goes in some really unique directions, and I think is very entertaining. So if you haven't seen this one, I think it's a perfect pick to add to your list.
They take a part of me with them.
Fingers is a 2019 dark comedy horror movie, written and directed by Juan Ortiz. It stars Jeremy Gardner, Sabina Friedman-Sykes, and Michael St. Michaels. The story's about an office manager who starts to confront her hangups about other people's body imperfections when one of her team members shows up to work missing a pinky.
Walter's missing a pinky.
Don't worry about my hand, please.
This is the definition of strange, creative, quirky, just very, very odd movie. Some people might not think this is a horror movie. It really depends on what your definitions of horror is. I wouldn't say this is a scary kind of movie. So if that's your definition of horror, then this is probably not going to be considered a horror movie by you. But if you're someone like me that thinks of dread and anxiety and tension and strange things that just make the pit of your stomach turn, then for me and you anyway, it is a horror movie. But this has body horror, but just all kinds of strangeness, the dialogue, the way people act, the different directions and story points, and it's just bizarre. It really is a very bizarre, but I think a very entertaining movie. It's one of those that is just definitely not like anything else. It's a movie that about halfway through, you'll just give up trying to guess where it's gonna go next, because it's impossible to know where this movie's going. It half the time doesn't even seem like it knows where it's going, but that's a lot of the fun of it. But it's an entertaining, charming movie in a very strange, disturbing way, but one I think you absolutely should check out. Watcher is a 2022 psychological mystery thriller. Written and directed by Chloe Okuno, it stars Micah Monroe, Carl Glusman, and Bern Gorman. A young American actress moves with her husband to Bucharest, but begins to suspect that a stranger who watches her from his apartment window may be a serial killer.
This guy has been watching us since we moved in.
Maybe he's staring at the woman who's staring at him.
This is such a great movie. It has a real Alfred Hitchcock kind of flavor to it, but modernized, because you could see some inspirations here from a movie like Rear Window. But even though you can see some elements of that, ultimately where it takes the story, the directions, and the focal point of what is going on in this are very different and unique. Because in Rear Window, Jimmy Stewart is vulnerable because of him being unable to walk, right? But in this, it's different because it's this woman who is able-bodied, but she's alone in this big city where she doesn't speak the language, and her husband doesn't believe her. No one seems to believe her around her. And slowly but surely, she feels more and more vulnerable and in danger. But what makes it really interesting is her starting to question herself and not being sure if she can trust her own instincts and herself in this situation. But it gets really intense. It's a definite nail-biter, keeping you on the edge of your seat for sure. It's also an expertly put together movie. The directing, the editing, the way it's shot, it's absolutely gorgeous. The cinematography is just super on point. And if you're like me and you're a big fan of Micah Monroe, this is one of my favorite performances from her. She's predominantly the only actor on screen, and she carries it with just her expressions, her body language, the way she expresses her emotions are so well done. I think this is an incredible psychological thriller and one that I highly, highly recommend.
I have information. I'm gonna help you. Stop!
Probably wasn't gonna help us.
Definitely sounded like he was gonna help us.
Boy Kills World is a 2023 dystopian comedy action thriller directed by Moritz Moore in his directorial debut. It stars Bill Skarsgård, Jessica Roth, and Michelle Dockery. The plot follows a campaign of vengeance by a martial arts expert who's rendered deaf and mute by an attack that killed his parents.
The day the Vanderkoys killed my family and left me deaf and mute.
I just don't get how this movie has flown so under the radar. I haven't heard anyone talking about it. It had a theatrical release, nobody talked about it. It's been on Hulu now for a few months, still no one talks about it. I think it's an absolute blast. It's really unique in a lot of ways, and it has this graphic novel, comic book, video game kind of feel to it. And with someone as popular as Bill Skarsgård, you think that this movie would have gotten some attention. But it's really fun because this character is deaf and mute, but you hear his thoughts. The whole movie is narrated by H. John Benjamin, who does the voice of the dad on Bob's Burgers. So it's just very funny just hearing his thoughts with that voice. But beyond that, it's just a kick-ass movie. It's very funny, sure, but the action, the violence, the frenetic way that it's shot, the colorful nature of the way the whole movie is put together, from the sets, the costume design, all of it, it's just so in your face, entertaining, and just a lot of fun. And sure, it's not really a horror movie, but it feels like it's close because it's very violent, very in your face, a lot of gore and grit, but it's also set in this dystopian future that has a very horror-esque feel about it as well. No matter what, it doesn't matter what this movie is labeled as. A thriller, a horror movie, an action movie, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't matter. I think it's just so entertaining, and it lives in the same type of world as a movie like Guns Akimbo. So if you enjoyed that movie and the style that the humor is, just the world and the way that it's set and the colorful nature of it, I think you definitely would enjoy this one. So do yourself a favor and check this one out.
It's the most important thing.
Spoonful of Sugar is a 2022 psychological horror movie directed by Mercedes Bryce Morgan. It stars Morgan Saylor, Kat Foster, and Michael Olivier. A disturbed babysitter experiences a sexual awakening while using LSD to treat a seemingly sick child from a family with dark secrets.
Most people are liars. If you want me to be part of your family, then I'm gonna have to ask you to do something for me.
This is a dark, uncomfortable, just very awkward and off-putting kind of movie. It makes you just feel uneasy the entire time because you just never really know the directions that it's gonna go or what exactly it's gonna do, where it's gonna draw the line. I mean, what ultimately is this movie gonna go for or not? It's really just this odd setup where you never feel quite right. The entire movie, the look of it, the style of it, the way it's edited together, the actors, the dialogue, just all of it has this strange and very off-putting feel and does some pretty bizarre and uncomfortable things. But the visuals are what really makes this movie cool because the LSD element, once that element is added to the movie, it makes you not sure what you're seeing and if what you're seeing is what's actually happening or if it's not. But I think this is an uncomfortable, twisted little movie that's definitely worth seeing.
Madness is over. This war is over!
Says who?
Brooklyn 45 is a 2023 supernatural horror movie. Written and directed by Ted Geoghegan, it stars Anne Ramsey, Jeremy Holm, and Ezra Buzzington. 5 veterans who've been friends since childhood gather together to support their troubled host, and the metaphoric ghosts of their past become all too literal.
Don't you dare get up. What? We have to end the seance before we break the circle. Look!
This is such a surprising movie. It's one of the most surprising movies from last year. It's another Shudder original. It got no fanfare. It just was put on Shudder one weekend and just very few people talked about it. I know the guys over on the horror show mentioned it some. I talked about it in a couple of my lists last year. But for the most part, it just has very much flown under the radar. And keep in mind, this is a very small movie. The entire movie takes place just in one apartment. But don't let that fool you, because the cast and how well they perform this, the story, the different directions that it takes, it is very, very good. But when it starts out for the first, 10 or 15 minutes, it doesn't seem like there's gonna be that much to it. It doesn't feel like it's gonna go to some of the heights and take some of the directions and go as hard as it ultimately does. But I promise you, if you stick with this, it gets dark, it gets disturbing, it's just extremely upsetting and bothersome on a lot of different levels. But it's one of the best written screenplays, in my opinion, that we saw last year. It's one of those movies that almost feels more like a book than it does a movie because there's not a lot visually per se that's happening. Most of what is happening is the dialogue and the conversations and what they're implying or the things ultimately that you start to discover. But it does ultimately have some really eerie, disturbing visuals as well. It's the definition of a hidden gem movie, a movie that just no one talks about and very few have seen. But I think it's one that if you give a chance, it'll really surprise you.
Get out of my way.
It's all part of the menu.
It's okay.
No, we're gonna die tonight.
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
The Menu is a 2022 dark comedy horror movie. Directed by Mark Mylod, it stars Anya Taylor-Joy, Ralph Fiennes, and Nicholas Hoult. The story focuses on a group of diners at an exclusive restaurant who discover the celebrity chef intends to kill them all before the night is out.
He's not just a chef, he's a storyteller. The game is trying to guess what the overarching theme of the entire meal is going to be.
This is one that did get quite a bit of buzz last year, but I think that it still doesn't really get as much credit as it deserves because this is just so expertly executed on every level. It's the kind of movie that I hope we don't ever really forget because it's one of those that because there isn't necessarily some iconic killer or, some crazy twist or something like that, I'm afraid that it could get lost over time. But I hope we don't, because this is such a well-written script. The characters are so flushed out and interesting, and yet it doesn't take too long to get there. You feel like you know everybody in this room, and yet it doesn't have to do some huge backstory for each one. And that just shows how expertly written the script is. And then the way that it's shot, it's just so beautifully shot. The cinematography is amazing. The attention to detail, the research that was done. They brought in a real chef to plate the food so that it would look really like something you would get at a really high-end restaurant. And the humor, the way that it's written, because it is this dark, twisted sense of humor, but it's not this lowbrow kind of humor, but instead more of a situational. It's these little things that kind of catch you off guard, especially John Leguizamo. I think he's fantastic in this movie. And I love that this movie lives in the horror genre, because it deals with kind of a different type of horror, that it isn't a scary movie. And I think a lot of people get this whole thing twisted and think that a horror movie has to be scary. But I don't think that it does. I think that horror lives in a lot of different emotions. And this really shows the different layers and the different types of emotion and feelings that are all encompassed in the horror genre. Because this gets eerie, it gets uncomfortable, it gets disturbing in this twisted, morbid, yet humorous kind of way. But I think if you have a twisted, macabre sense of humor, this movie is so much fun, and one I think is a perfect pick for this Saturday night. So do yourself a favor this weekend, pick one of the movies off of this list, grab your popcorn and your candy, and enjoy! And I want to give a huge, massive, enormous thank you to the Ghost Pirate crew, to you guys over on Patreon, and to the channel members over here. You guys mean so much to me. And if you would like to help support this channel over on Patreon, there's a link down in the description, or you can become a channel member and help support the channel that way by clicking on that join button down there. But like always, thank you so much for watching. Please crush that like button, and remember guys, horror can be fun. And if you enjoyed this, click right here to watch me talk about 10 more horror movies that I think you'll enjoy. And I'll see you guys next time.